In many ways, modern man, Homo sapiens, is a stranger to Earth. Ever since Charles Darwin shocked the scholars and theologians of his time with the evidence of evolution, life on Earth has been traced through man and the primates, mammals, and vertebrates, and backward through ever lower life forms to the point billions of years ago at which life is presumed to have begun. But having reached these beginnings and having begun to contemplate the probabilities of life elsewhere in our solar system and beyond, the scholars have become uneasy about life on Earth. Somehow it doesn't belong here. If it began through a series of spontaneous chemical reactions, why does life on Earth have but a single source and not a multitude of chance sources? And why does all living matter on Earth contain too little of the chemical elements that abound on Earth and too much of those that are rare on our planet? Was life, then, imported to Earth from elsewhere? Man's position in this evolutionary chain has compounded the puzzle. Finding a broken skull here, a jaw there, scholars at first believed that man originated in Asia some half million years ago. But as older fossils were found, it became evident that the mills of evolution grind much, much slower. Man's ancestor apes are now placed at a staggering 25 million years ago. Discoveries in East Africa reveal a transition to man-like apes some 14 million years ago. It was about 11 million years later that the first ape man worthy of classification Homo appeared there. The first being considered to be truly manlike existed in the same part of Africa some 2 million years ago. It took yet another million years to produce Homo erectus. Finally, another 900,000 years for the first primitive man to appear. He is named Neanderthal after the site where his remains were first found. In spite of the passage of more than 2 million years between advanced Australopithecus and Neanderthal, the tools of the two groups, sharp stones, were virtually alike, and the groups themselves were hardly distinguishable. Then suddenly and inexplicably, some 35,000 years ago, Homo sapiens appeared as if from nowhere and swept Neanderthal man from the face of Earth. These modern men, named Cro-Magnon, look so much like us that if dressed like us in modern clothes, they would be lost in the crowds of any European or American city. Because of the magnificent cave art which they created, they were at first called cavemen. In fact, they roamed the earth freely, for they knew how to build shelters and homes of stone and animal skins wherever they went. For millions of years, man's tools had been simple stones of useful shapes. Cro-Magnon man, however, made specialized tools and weapons of wood and bones. He was no longer a naked ape, or used skins for clothing. His society was organized. He lived in clans with a patriarchal hegemony. His cave drawings bespeak artistry and depth of feeling. His drawings and sculptures evidence some form of religion, apparent in the worship of a mother goddess, who was sometimes depicted with the sign of the moon's crescent. He buried his dead, and must therefore have had some philosophies regarding life, death, and perhaps even an afterlife. As mysterious and unexplained as the appearance of Cro-Magnon man has been, the puzzle is still more complicated, for as other remains of modern man were discovered, it became apparent that Cro-Magnon man stemmed from an even earlier Homo sapiens who lived in Western Asia and North Africa some 250,000 years before Cro-Magnon man. The appearance of modern man a mere 700,000 years before Homo erectus and some 200,000 years before Neanderthal man is absolutely implausible. It is also clear that Homo sapiens represent such an extreme departure from the slow evolutionary processes that many of our features, such as our ability to speak, are totally unrelated to earlier primates. An outstanding authority in the subject, Professor Theodosius Dubzhansky, was especially puzzled by the fact that this development took place during a period when Earth was going through an ice age, a most unpropitious time for evolutionary advance. Pointing out that Homo sapien lacks completely some of the peculiarities of the previously known types and has some that never appeared before, he concluded, modern man has many fossil collateral relatives, but no progenitors. The derivation of Homo sapiens, then, becomes a puzzle. How, then, did the ancestors of modern man appear some 300,000 years ago instead of 2 million or 3 million years in the future following further evolutionary development? Were we imported to Earth from elsewhere? Or were we, as the Old Testament and other ancient sources claim, created by the gods? We now know where civilization began and how it developed once it began. The unanswered question is, why? Why did civilization come about at all? For as most scholars now admit in frustration, by all data, man should still be without civilization. There's no obvious reason that we should be any more civilized than the primitive tribes of the Amazon jungles or the inaccessible parts of New Guinea. But we are told these tribesmen still live as if in the Stone Age because they've all been isolated. But isolated from what? If they've been living on the same earth as we, why have they not acquired the same knowledge of sciences and technologies on their own as we supposedly have? The real puzzle, however, is not the backwardness of the Bushmen, but our advancement, for it's now recognized that in the normal course of evolution, man should still be typified by the Bushmen and not by us. It took man some 2 million years to advance in his tool industries from the use of stones as he found them to the realization that he could chip and shape stones to better suit his purposes. Why not another 2 million years to learn to use other materials and another 10 million years to master mathematics and engineering and astronomy? Yet here we are, less than 50,000 years from Neanderthal man landing astronauts on the moon. The obvious question then is this: did we and our Mediterranean ancestors really acquire this advanced civilization on our own? Though Cro-Magnon man did not build skyscrapers nor use metals, there is no doubt that his was a sudden and revolutionary civilization. His mobility, ability to build shelters, his desire to clothe himself, his manufactured tools, his art, were all sudden high civilization breaking an endless beginning of man's culture that stretched over millions of years and advanced at a painfully slow pace. Though our scholars cannot explain the appearance of Homo sapiens and the civilization of Cro-Magnon man, there is by now no doubt regarding the civilization's place of origin, the Near East. The uplands and mountain ranges that extend in a semi-arc from the Sargos Mountains in the east, where present-day Iran and Iraq border each other, through Ararat and Taurus ranges in the north, then down, westward and southward to the hill lands of Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, are replete with caves where the evidence of prehistoric but modern man have been preserved. One of these caves, Shanidar, is located in the northeastern part of the semi-arc of civilization. Nowadays, fierce Kurdish tribesmen seek shelter in the area's caves for themselves and their flocks during the cold winter months. So it was, one wintry night 44,000 years ago, when a family of 7 sought shelter in the cave at Shanidar. Their remains? They were evidently crushed to death by a rockfall we discovered in 1957 by a startled Ralph Solecki, who went to the area in search of evidence of early man. What he found was more than he expected. As layer upon layer of debris was removed, it became apparent that the cave preserved a clear record of man's habitation in the area from about 100,000 to some 13,000 years ago. What this record showed was as surprising as the find itself. Man's culture has shown not a progression, but a regression. Starting from a certain standard, the following generation showed not more advanced, but less advanced standards of civilized life. And from about 27,000 BC to 11,000 BC, the regressing and dwindling population reached the point of an almost complete absence of habitation. For reasons that are assumed to have been climatic, man was almost completely gone from the whole area for some 16,000 years. And then around 11,000 BC, thinking man reappeared with new vigor and on an inexplicably higher cultural level. It was as if an unseen coach, watching the faltering human game, dispatched to the field a fresh and better trained team to take over from the exhausted one. Throughout the many millions of years of his endless beginning, man was nature's child. He subsisted by gathering foods that grew wild, by hunting the wild animals, by catching wild birds and fishes. But just as man's settlements were thinning out, just as he was abandoning his abodes, when his material and artistic achievements were disappearing, just then, suddenly, with no apparent reason, and without any prior known period of gradual preparation, man became a farmer. Agriculture began exactly where thinking man had emerged earlier with his first crude civilization, in the Near East. Man's first farming venture was the cultivation of wheat and barley. However, scholars remain baffled by the profusion of other plants and cereals basic to human survival and the advancement that kept coming out of the Near East. These included in rapid succession millet, rye, and spelt, Among the edible cereals, flax, which provided fibers and edible oil, and a variety of fruit bearing shrubs and trees. In every instance, the plant was undoubtedly domesticated in the Near East for millennia before it reached Europe. It was as though the Near East was some kind of a genetic botanical laboratory, guided by an unseen hand. The general location of Eden was certainly known to the biblical generations. It was east of the land of Israel, in a land watered by four major rivers, two of which are the Tigris and the Euphrates. The Bible, like the scholars, places the start of vine cultivation in the mountains of northern Mesopotamia. Apples, pears, olives, figs, almonds, pistachios, walnuts all originated in the Near East and spread from there to other parts of the world. We cannot help recalling that the Old Testament preceded our scholars in identifying the very same area as the world's first orchard, the Garden of Eden. The book of Genesis located the first orchard in northeastern Mesopotamia. Bible and science are in full agreement. Science tells us that the process went from wild grasses to wild cereals to cultivated cereals, followed by fruit bearing shrubs and trees. This is exactly the process detailed in the first chapter of the book of Genesis. And the Lord said, "Let the earth bring forth grasses, cereals that by seeds produce seeds, fruit trees that bear fruit by species, which contain the seeds within themselves." And it was so. From an overall point of view, it would be appropriate to call the age that began about 11,000 BC not the Middle Stone Age, but the age of domestication. Within the span of a mere 3,600 years, man became a farmer, and wild plants and animals were domesticated. Then a new age clearly followed with the appearance of pottery. For reasons that still elude our scholars, but which will become clear as we unfold our tale of prehistoric events here, man's march towards civilization was confined to the highlands of the Near East. The discovery of the many uses to which clay could be put was contemporary with man's descent from his mountain abodes. By the 7th millennium BC, the Near Eastern arc of civilization was teeming with clay or pottery cultures. But once again, progress slowed, and by 4500 BC, archaeological evidence indicates regression was all around. Pottery became simpler. Stone utensils, a relic of the Stone Age, again became predominant. Inhabited sites reveal fewer remains. Some sites that had been centers of pottery and clay industries began to be abandoned, and distinct clay manufacturing disappeared. Man and his culture were clearly on the decline. Then suddenly, unexpectedly, inexplicably, the Near East witnessed the blossoming of the greatest civilization imaginable, a civilization in which our own is firmly rooted. A mysterious hand once more picked man out of his decline and raised him to an even higher level of culture, knowledge, and civilization. For a long time, Western man believed that his civilization was the gift of Rome and Greece. But the Greek philosophers themselves wrote repeatedly that they had drawn on even earlier sources. The decipherment of the ancient Egyptian script and language, and the archaeological efforts that followed, revealed to Western man that a high civilization had existed in Egypt well before the advent of the Greek civilization. Was the origin of our civilization, then, in Egypt? Well, as logical as that conclusion would have seemed, the facts militated against it. Greek scholars did describe visits to Egypt, but the ancient sources of knowledge of which they spoke were found elsewhere. The pre-Hellenic cultures of the Aegean Sea, the Minoan on the island of Crete, and the Mycenaean on the Greek mainland, revealed evidence that the Near Eastern, not the Egyptian culture, had been adopted. Syria and Anatolia, not Egypt, were the principal avenues through which an earlier civilization became available to the Greeks. Scholars have been fascinated to discover a growing number of similarities between the Semitic and Hellenic civilizations. Professor Cyrus H. Gordon opened up a new field of study by showing that an earlier Minoan script, called Linear A, represented a Semitic language. He concluded that the pattern of the Hebrew and Minoan civilizations is the same to a remarkable extent. Even the Hellenic alphabet, from which the Latin and our own alphabets derive, came from the Near East. The scholars were aware, of course, of Greek contacts with the Near East in the first millennium BC, culminating with the defeat of the Persians by Alexander the Macedonian in 331 BC. Greek records contain much information about these Persians and their lands. It has been established by now that the cultural, religious, and historic roots of these old Persians go back to the earlier empires of Babylon and Assyria, whose extent and fall is recorded in the Old Testament. Many of the world's museums count among their prize exhibits the ceremonial gates, the winged bulls, bas relief chariots, tools, utensils, jewelry, statues, and other objects made of every conceivable material that have been dug out of the mounds of Assyria and Babylonia. But the true treasures of these kingdoms were their written records, thousands upon thousands of inscriptions in the cuneiform script, including cosmologic tales, epic poems, histories of kings, temple records, commercial contracts, marriage and divorce records, astronomical tables, astrological forecasts, mathematical formulas, geographic list, grammar and vocabulary school text, and, not least of all, texts dealing with the names, genealogies, epithets, deeds, powers, and duties of the gods. The common language that formed the cultural, historical, and religious bond between Assyria and Babylonia was Akkadian. It was the first known Semitic language, akin to but predating Hebrew. But the Assyrians and the Babylonians laid no claim to having invented the language or its script. Indeed, many of their tablets bore the postscripts that they had been copied from earlier originals. Who, then, invented the cuneiform script and developed the language, its precise grammar and rich vocabulary? Who wrote the earlier originals? And why did the Assyrians and Babylonians call the language Akkadian? Attention once more focuses on the book of Genesis and the beginning of his kingdom, Babel, Erech, and Akkad. The ruins of Mesopotamia have provided conclusive evidence that once upon a time there indeed existed a kingdom by the name of Akkad, established by a much earlier ruler who called himself a Sherakan, righteous ruler. He claimed in his inscriptions that his empire stretched by the grace of the god Enlil from the lower sea, the Persian Gulf, to the upper sea, believed to be the Mediterranean. The scholars stood awed. They had come upon a Mesopotamian empire in the 3rd millennium BC. There was a leap backwards of some 2,000 years from the Assyrian Sargon of Der-Sharakin and Sargon of Akkad. And yet, the mounds that were dug up brought to light literature and art, science and politics, commerce and communication, a full-fledged civilization long before the appearance of Babylonia or Assyria. Moreover, it was obviously the predecessor and the source of the later Mesopotamian civilizations. Assyria and Babylonia were only branches off the Akkadian trunk. It also appeared certain that there must have been kingdoms and cities and civilizations in Mesopotamia even before the 3rd millennium BC. The only question was, how far back did one have to go to find the first civilized kingdom? The key that unlocked the puzzle was yet another language. Scholars took a look at the Akkadian inscriptions, basically the Akkadian cuneiform script, which was syllabic. Each sign stood for a complete syllable, yet the script made extensive use of signs that were not phonetic syllables, but conveyed the meaning God, city, country, and the like. The only possible explanation for this phenomenon was that these signs were remains of an earlier writing method, which used pictographs. Akkadian, then, must have been preceded by another language that used a writing method akin to the Egyptian hieroglyphs. It was soon obvious that an earlier language, and not just an earlier form of writing, was involved here. Scholars found that Akkadian inscriptions and text made extensive use of loanwords, words borrowed intact from another language, in the same way a modern Frenchman would borrow the English word weekend. This was especially true where scientific and technical terminology was involved, and also in matters dealing with the gods and the heavens. In January of 1869, Jules Oppert suggested to the French Society of Numismatics and Archaeology that recognition be given to the existence of a pre-Akkadian language and people, pointing out that the early rulers of Mesopotamia proclaimed their legitimacy by taking the title King of Sumer and Akkad. He suggested that the people be called Sumerians and their land Sumer. Once the scholars had accepted these conclusions, the floodgates were opened. The decipherment of the Sumerian language and script, and the realization that the Sumerians and their culture were the fountainhead of all Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian achievements, spurred archaeological searches in southern Mesopotamia. All of the evidence now indicated that the beginning was there. The first significant excavation of the Sumerian site was begun in 1877 by French archaeologists, and the finds from this single site were so extensive that others continued to dig there until 1933 without completing the job. The site proved to be an early Sumerian city, indeed a royal city. The dynasty had started around 2900 BC and lasted nearly 650 years. During this time, 43 Enses reigned without interruption at Lagash. Their names, genealogies, and links of rule were all neatly recorded. One of the better-known rulers of Lagash was Gudea. He had a large number of statues made of himself, all showing him in a votive stance, praying to his gods. This stance was no pretense. Gudea had indeed devoted himself to the adoration of Ningirsu, his principal deity, and the construction and rebuilding of temples. His many inscriptions reveal that in the search for exquisite building material, he obtained gold from Africa and Anatolia, silver from the Taurus Mountains, cedars from Lebanon, other rare woods from Ararat, copper from the Zagros Range, diorite from Egypt, carnelian from Ethiopia, and other materials from lands yet unidentified by scholars. When Moses built for the Lord God a residence in the desert, he did so according to very detailed instructions provided by the Lord. 1,200 years before Moses, Gudea made the same claim. The instructions he recorded in one very long inscription were given him in a vision. A man that shone like the heaven, by whose side stood a divine bird, commanded me to build his temple. This man, who from the crown on his head was obviously a god, was later identified as the god Ningirsu. With him was a goddess who held a tablet of her favorite star of the heavens. Her other hand held a holy stylus, with which she indicated to Gudea the favorable planet. A third man, also a god, held in his hand a tablet of precious stone, the plan of the temple it contained. One of Gudea's statues shows him seated, with this tablet on his knees. On the tablet, the divine drawing can clearly be seen. Wise as he was, Gudea was baffled by these architectural instructions, and he sought the advice of a goddess who could interpret divine messages. She explained to him the meaning of the instructions, the plan's measurements, and the size and shape of the bricks to be used. Gudea then employed a male diviner, maker of decisions, and a female searcher of secrets to locate the site on the city's outskirts, where the god wished his temple to be built. He then recruited 216,000 people for the construction job. Gudea's bafflement can readily be understood, for the simple-looking floor plan supposedly gave him the necessary information to build a complex ziggurat, rising high by 7 stages. The divine architects, it appears, were able to provide with a single floor plan, accompanied by 7 varying scales, the complete instructions for the construction of a 7-stage high-rise temple. It's been said that war spurs man to scientific and material breakthroughs. In ancient Sumer, it seems, temple construction spurred the people and their rulers into greater technological achievements. The ability to carry out major construction work according to prepared architectural plans, to organize and feed a huge labor force, to flatten lands and raise mounds, to mold bricks and transport stones, to bring rare metal and other materials from afar, to cast metal and shape utensils and ornaments, all clearly speak of a high civilization already in full bloom in the 3rd millennium BC. As masterful as even the earliest Sumerian temples were, they represented but the tip of an iceberg of the scope and richness of the material achievements of the first great civilization known to man. In addition to the invention and development of writing, the Sumerians should be credited with the invention of printing. Millennia before Johann Gutenberg invented printing by using movable type, Sumerian scribes used ready-made type of the various pictographic signs which they used as we now use rubber stamps to impress the desired sequence of signs in the wet clay. They also invented the forerunner of our rotary presses, the cylinder seal. Made of extremely hard stone, it was a small cylinder into which the message or design had been engraved in reverse. Whenever the seal was rolled on wet clay, the imprint created a positive impression. No high civilization would have been possible without a parallel advanced system of mathematics. The Sumerian system, called sexagesimal, combined a mundane 10 with a celestial 6 to obtain a base figure 60. It enables the Sumerians to divide into fractions and multiply into millions. The 360-degree circle, the foot, and its 12 inches are but a few of the examples of the vestiges of Sumerian mathematics still evident in our daily life. The many varieties of metals and alloys for which Sumerian and Akkadian names have been found, and the extensive technological terminology, attest to the high level of metallurgy in ancient Mesopotamia. The Sumerian use of petroleum products was also basic to the advanced chemistry. Sick persons in Sumerian times could choose between an azu, that's a water physician, or an iazu, oil physician. Sumerian medical tests deal with diagnosis and prescriptions. One of Sumer's earliest material achievements was the development of textile and clothing industries. Another major Sumerian achievement was its agriculture. The Sumerians used their two great rivers as an artificial network of canals for waterborne transportation of people, goods, and cattle. In 1956, Professor Samuel M. Kramer, one of the great Sumerologists of our time, reviewed the literary legacy found beneath the mounds of Sumer. The table of contents of From the Tablets of Sumer is a gem in itself, for each one of the 25 chapters described a Sumerian first, including the first schools, the first bicameral Congress, the first historian, the first pharmacopoeia, the first farmer's almanac, the first cosmogony, the first cosmology, the first Job, the first proverbs and sayings, the first literary debates, the first Noah, the first library catalog, and man's first heroic age, his first law codes and social reforms, his first medicine, agriculture, and search for world peace and harmony. This is no exaggeration. The first schools were established in Sumer as a direct outgrowth of the invention and introduction of writing. As Sumer's civilization was uncovered, it became clear that the first for a system of laws, for concepts of social order, and for fair administration of justice belonged to Sumer. While the Babylonians made rules and regulations, the Sumerians were concerned with justice, for they believed that the gods appointed the kings primarily to assure justice in the land. The Sumerian concern with justice, or its absence, also found expression in what Professor Kramer called the first Job. Matching together fragments of clay tablets at the Istanbul Museum of Antiquities, Kramer was able to read a good part of a Sumerian poem which, like the biblical book of Job, dealt with the complaint of a righteous man who, instead of being blessed by the gods, was made to suffer all manner of loss and disrespect. "My righteous word has been turned into a lie," he cried out in anguish. In its second part, the anonymous sufferer petitions his God in a manner akin to some of the verses in the Hebrew Psalms. "My God, you who are my Father, who beget me, lift up my face. How long will you neglect me, leave me unprotected, leave me without guidance?" Then follows a happy ending. The righteous words, the pure words uttered by him, his God accepted. His God withdrew his hand from the evil pronouncement. The material and spiritual achievements of the Sumerian civilization were also accompanied by an extensive development of the performing arts. A team of scholars from the University of California at Berkeley made news in March 1974 when they announced that they had deciphered the world's oldest song. "We always knew," the Berkeley team explained, "that there was music in the earlier Assyrio-Babylonian civilization, but until this deciphering, we didn't know that it was the same heptatonic diatonic scale that is characteristic of contemporary Western music and of Greek music of the first millennium BC. Until now, it was thought that Western music originated in Greece. Now it's been established that our music, as so much else of Western civilization, originated in Mesopotamia." After excavating at Lagash, the archaeologist Spade uncovered Nippur, the one-time religious center of Sumer and Akkad. At Shuruppak, schoolhouses dating to the 3rd millennium BC were found. At Ur, scholars found magnificent vases, jewelry, weapons, chariots, helmets made of gold, silver, copper, and bronze, the remains of a weaving factory, and a towering ziggurat. At Kish, monumental buildings and a ziggurat from at least 3000 BC were unearthed. Uruk took the archaeologists back into the 4th millennium BC. Further south, archaeologists found Urdu, the first Sumerian city. When the Spades came upon the foundations of the first temple, below that was virgin soil. The time was about 3800 BC. That is when civilization began. Having begun to use the stones as tools some 2 million years earlier, man achieved this unprecedented civilization in about 3800 BC. And the perplexing fact about this is